All right, off to the financial projections. All right, if we can start on board book page 73 and go through the assumptions.
And Scott, why don't you make a mention of who Forecast-5 is, because there's new board members on here as opposed to the people who've gone through with these projections have been, and what the company was and what have you. So why don't you give us a little background?
All right, Forecast-5 is a split off from PMA Financial. What we do with them is work with them each year to try to see where financially we will be, trying to go out 3 to 5 years with it. Our projections are 5 years. The district gives the assumptions, and we use their program to come up with these projections on it, and we can manipulate whatever we can within the assumption range to try to make these as accurate as possible. So if we start with the revenue projections, the tax collection has been increased to 99% from 98.5%. Each 1% is approximately $195,000 increase to the district. The consumer price index, the CPI factor, is at 2% for all of the years. The general state aid calculation reflects the new evidence-based formula that the state just came out with. There would be an increase in FY20, and then it would be held at that $50,000 increase, and that is, of course, if the state does pay and keeps funding the formula as it's supposed to be. If we look at new construction that's out there, roughly a new construction of $200,000 would generate about $5,300 for the district of additional operating revenue.
So instead of just reading these, do you have key ones you want us to focus on? Or do you want to just, instead of going through each one?
I'll just summarize them real
So
quick.
if we're going up 0.5% on property calculation, that's $100,000. 0.5% on CPI, that's $100,000.
Mm-hmm.
50,000 on general state aid, so that's $250,000, and $5,300 on the $200,000 in EAB.
Yes.
So we're roughly $250,000. We're projecting increase in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then on the expenditure side, we have salaries increasing at 3%. That's admin, our teaching staff, and our non-certified staff. We have built in retirement savings, and also we have per the contract, the post-retirement benefits are reflected as we move forward through the projections. The retirement savings will offset some of the salary increases. Our medical, we are going to be increasing at 6.5% based on our historical trend. And also I had a conversation with our current provider, and their underwriter suggested 6.5% moving through the entire projection. And our hiring projections are based off of the enrollment projections that you saw at an earlier board meeting, increasing 1 FTE in 20 and 21, and then decreasing that same FTE in 2023 based on the projection.
22, 23.
So on average, we're going to be flat. in our
Basically
staff.
no change. Okay, if we can go to the next page for the revenue analysis. And how this is going to work, I'm just going to kind of go through local, state, and federal. If you notice, our local, as we said, would go up based off of CPI. The reason that you see an increase in FY19 of 4.27%, you might be saying, why isn't it 2? This is based off of our AFR figures, and the AFR figures captures the additional 60 days after after June 30th. So it's the accrual amount. This would be what was in our audit. So per this, I under budgeted the current budget, not reflecting the AFR figures, and they use the AFR figures. There is a 2% goes across until you hit FY23, and on this one, there will be a timing issue with Cook County. We will be having some of our debt service payment coming off, so we still will be collecting the 55% of it, which would then go into our operating funds. And then the following year, it would make up for the deduction in the debt service payment. Our local revenue, the increase in next year's is our one-to-one initiative. We'll collect more for the Chromebooks, and then it will stay the same with no change as you go through the projection. The state revenue, you will see the change in general state aid. It adds in the new categories. If you look at the footnote on the bottom, it shows what the new categories are in it. It really is no change other than in years FY20 through 23, it reflects the additional 50,000 if the state gives us based off of the projection that we're supposed to get.
So it really isn't going up 34%, because in the one below it goes down by 40%.
Yes,
And
it's
that's just because
taking
they
out
lumped
those other-
everything into one account.
So we should just look at the total state revenue line.
Yeah.
Yes, the
Yeah.
total gives like the correct projection.
All right.
Fed?
For our federal, there is a decrease going next year. The decrease is our special ed grant funds from IDEA. And basically, it's not that we're losing it. That money was applied to our purchase service agreement
With
for
who?
LADSI. So we're not losing it. It just went towards bringing our actual purchase service down, applying the money.
Can you, I don't know, thought I understood this. I mean, if it's revenue, it's revenue. Why is it not revenue here because we're using it for LADSI? Is the money going directly to LADSI?
It flows through LADSI, and then they take whatever
Okay.
the allocation would be.
So it
and we
goes to
apply it-
LADSI first.
And then we
Yes.
apply it to
I
our
got it.
purchase
So
service
it's not
agreement.
revenue, doesn't go to our county treasurer for us?
No, no,
Alright.
it flows through
That's part of
LADSI.
us being part of that cooperative. It goes to them, they apply it to
Got
our
it.
bills.
Thank you.
And as we move through this, if we look at the chart on the bottom, you can see that the district is very reliant on the property taxes. That's the biggest source of revenue on that at 79%. As we move to the next page to go over the expenditure analysis, in the salary line, we said in the assumptions that our salaries are going up 3%. You'll notice that the percent changes there are not 3%. The reason for that is it's taking into account the retirement savings that we will be seeing as our staff starts to retire here. We do have some big savings in, as you can see, starting in FY 21, 22, and 23. And also factored into that change is some FTE that will go up and go down. So that's the variance that you see with the average. Benefits are also the same thing. As you move up and down with the staff, things change with it, so it won't give you the clear 6.5%, but it is pretty close. The next section that I'd like to look at is the purchase service. We did increase the Airmark purchase service by 2%, which is the CPI factor, and transportation by 5%. All other purchase service agreements were held at the current level that they're currently at. So that's why it doesn't show going up by 2%, which is the CPI. The non-capital equipment, there is an increase going next year. That is for the increase cost of our Chromebooks. Last year of implementation for full or full amount of all the grades having the one-to-one initiative.
And that's offset on the revenue side, though, you showed us, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing would be under the other objects. As you go out, we do have some students who are outplaced will be coming off the books, so there will be a decrease in outplaced tuition. And at the bottom of the page, it shows the pie chart, And as you can see, salary and benefits, 72% of all expenditures. Very significant because it's really hard to make a change unless you really mess with the staffing or the salaries and benefits.
So if I look at the total here, you predict 2% inflation on each year over the 5-year period, right, Scott?
Mm-hmm.
But the first 2 years were a little over the 2%, and then the last 3 years, we project that our expenditures will be less than inflation.
And with that, we currently took the original projection was at 3.5% per what our current contract is, and then when the new contract comes, it dropped to 3% for the staff, and also with those retirement savings.
Right.
Is where you'll see the percentage go down.
No, I'm saying that's a good thing.
That's a good thing.
If we're comfortable with this projection, we're projecting over the 5-year period that our expenditures aren't even going to increase as much as inflation.
Yes.
Okay.
The last 3 years.
Yeah, but
The
if
last-
you did if you took 2% a year, it would be
Average,
more
right.
than on average, it's less than 2%.
And then if we look at the projected summary, we really want to look at FY19 through FY23, and we want to look at the line that says surplus deficit, including other financial sources, which captures the best picture as far as the projection. It does show deficit spending on that throughout the entire projection. However, it's still within the board policy for fund balance to as a percent of an expenditure as expenditures with it.
So in next year, you're projecting around 103,000.
Yes.
Then in 20 to 22, that's where we get closer to 4 or 500,000.
Yes. And then it drops back down.
Drops down to 21 by year 23.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, if we look at the balances, the percent of expenditures, we never go, our policy requires to stay above 33%.
33%, that is
So that we
correct.
have and that's also how we're evaluated to a certain extent, we talked about before by
With the
state.
profile.
But we, even though we're predicting deficit spending, we're predicting to stay well within the limits of our policy and what our reserve has to be, right?
Yes.
And actually, under the new state formula, you actually get more revenue if you have less of reserve now, don't you?
You do.
So you're actually kind of penalized for having reserves versus staying close to the
To your
policy.
balance policy.
Probably gets you more revenues from the state, assuming they keep the formula similar over a 5-year, right?
If the board, if I could step in, Scott, that's a good job, by the way.
Yeah.
You knew all the information, and
He's got one more page there, too.
I'd like to go through that last page.
Okay.
So, Mary, if you could go to the last chart, and it may be easier to go back and forth, but the blue line is 33% of our expenses. The red line is the fiscal year end balances. So if you see how this chart, obviously with the deficit spending, it would take fund balances down, but at the end of 5 years, we would still have more than the 33% that's required by board policy. The other thing I'd like to bring to the board's attention that if we can manage these deficits to stay at or below what we're projecting with these deficits, in 2023, our debt service starts to come off the books for the taxpayers. So if you kind of look at the concept we're laying out here, is if we minimize our deficit spending but still spend down some fund balance without cutting programs or cutting services to kids or the community, we should be able to control it to a point to where by 2023, when the bonds begin to come off of the taxpayers, we then can look at within 5 years or 6 years from now, the possibility of doing a small ed rate increase without actually increasing the taxes to the taxpayers, because they'll be getting, their property tax bill will decrease by the bonds coming off, and if we can figure out what we need in order to improve our fund balance or our operating cost. And still provide a savings to the taxpayer, and that would be, I think, something that might be amendable to the community. If you think about it, we're projecting going out from 2023. So prior to my arrival in 2011, a referendum was ran and was defeated, and we've made operational changes, we've changed some of the way we staff, we've changed activities, pay to participate, we've did some things with our debt and restructuring our debt, refinancing. So we were able, if this can all hold to fruition, we'll be able to go 12 years, most of those years with balanced budgets or low deficits, and without having to increase the taxes for an ed rate increase. So we went from in 2011 to saying we needed a referendum, and we were able to go 12 years.
Yeah, we were in deficit spending when you came on.
All right. So if we can stick to these projections and work with our union and control our salary increase, benefit increases, and continue to offer the retirement incentives, et cetera, and control our cost, I think we can do this. This lays out a 5-year plan for the board to where we would stay within our policy, as well as provide us enough time for some of that other debt that's on the taxpayers' backs to come off, and then revisit this 5 years from now. So that's the 30,000-foot view.
So, my question is, this 5-cast is dramatically different than last year's 5-cast. Millions of dollars difference.
Why?
Why should we trust this one, or not trust that one, or not trust this one and trust that one?
So we went through,
we just changed the assumptions, 500 revenue, 500
Well, we went through, I think
expenditures,
we had
and we got
a-
$1 million difference.
I think some past interactions with, Tim's asked this question before, and it's not fair for Scott to answer this. I can answer this with my experience or history here. And it's same with the budget, and you've asked this question with the budget. The previous board has always been budget and assume more on expenditures, less on revenues, to always see worst case scenario. Well, when you run those projections of worst case scenario with the detail that a Forecast-5 puts in there with all the algorithms and everything, it produces 5-year projections that show $1 million deficit annually, and we're out of fund balance by the end of the 5 years.
Right.
And so this year with
That
Tim
makes us nervous.
Yeah, with Tim and Gary, and we went into this when we met with Scott, when we met with the consultant, we said we have to clean up our assumptions, because the previous projections we've shown have never come to fruition. If anything, they've been the opposite. We showed expected $500,000 deficit, and we'll have a $500,000 surplus, right? So that's $1 million swing. So that's why we went and we raised property taxes as close to 100,000. We went specifically what was on our teacher, our projections. Now, this could change in the event that all of a sudden we get an attendance spike, right? We had to add a teacher instead of cut a teacher in 22. But we tried to keep this as real.
We have to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement.
Correct. We have to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement that would fall in that 3% range. Otherwise, we would have to expect to cut staff. I mean, those are all things that we're assuming that. But looking at our historical trend, we and Scott pulled the last 2 contracts, and if it came close to 3%, it's fair and it's consistent with the 2 previous contracts. And
I think there's 2 big issues there. Number one, the increase in the percent for revenue. The second one is we didn't have any vision of retirements, and retirements are playing a big key to this assumption, and we've already got a couple committed to retiring, and we know those dates. But when we ran the assumption before, when you saw the salary increases, they were 3% across, always 3%, 3%, 3%, without any impact of retirement, and additional staffing that was requested in those projections. So that's I think if you look at that, you go look at the increase in salaries in the historical projections, you'll see they were typically at 3% coming in each, and that's a big, calculate that on, you'll see that probably is those two big issues, that percent increase in the revenue and the fact that we are having some vision now on the group of people retiring.
And I
We
also
were able to
think
refinance our bonds, that helped us.
No, it has.
that doesn't
That has
affect
anything in
this,
there.
it's not in this
It's not
projection.
in projection, we don't, this is strictly the education side, not the. That's our-
And we pushed them pretty hard on, like the question I asked, if you're projecting 2% inflation, why are expenses not going up at least 2%? And
Right.
Scott went through a lot of digging and effort to be able to explain why he's comfortable that those numbers are accurate. Or, you know, why if you're doing 3% salary, and then you look, and Gary pretty much explained it, but you look and then in the fifth year, we're like, our salaries are going down. It's because we know that several teachers that are at a very high rate are going to be replaced by teachers that'll start somewhere near the starting rate. So, I mean, we did go through a period, when some of us first came on the board, we had, maybe half dozen, 8 retirements, something like that. But then we went through a period where almost having no retirements. And, you know, if you have big groups of retirement, it does
And it does.
help the budget.
Sure.
I feel like it tends to be cyclical too
Yes.
in education. It's similar. If you look at the attendance numbers, right, they mirror each other. So
But I just wanted to ask the question.
No,
It's a real good question.
I mean, because they're
No,
just different, and I like accurate budgets.
Yeah,
We talked about that. And,
Yeah, yeah.
if this one's more accurate, it's still not great, but it's better,
At least, and it also lays out a plan for something for us to follow.
Well, the other one did the same thing, but this one's a better plan, right?
The other one laid out a plan, but it was saying 97%
Assuming we get
taxes.
2% growth. And
Correct.
Assuming,
That's why they're called assumptions.
That's why they're called assumptions.
Right.
So, there's not much else to report. Scott's now, the next project I'm having him move forward on in February is preparing a tentative budget so that in March,
The board can see how close this aligns between.
Well, we already know what the budget is for next year.
That's his goal, is that it's gotta match the projections.
Yeah. Minus 751,000.
Right, so.
But it's gonna be zero.
But the board wanted to see a tentative budget before any staffing reductions. Technically, under school law, that staffing reductions need to take place usually by the end of March. And so if where this gets kind of goofy is that under the school budget calendar in Illinois, you do your budget after you do your staffing. So we wanted to have a tentative budget out there before we do staffing, just in case something does not add up based on what the projections are. But we're pretty sure that they'll be pretty close, correct?
That's what I'm hoping.
Correct?
Correct.
All right. Okay, you want to move on?
All right. This is a chance for visitors' comments. Seeing there are no visitors in the audience, I will not read the policy. Have a chance now for any Board of Education members for additional discussion items. Looking to my left, anyone?
Nope.
Any additional discussion items?
No, thank
Am I
you.
right? No? All right. Any updates on police department radio?
Nope.
No, nothing?